Galatians chapter 5, freedom, obligation, and the warning against misplaced justification. This teaching on Galatians chapter 5 assumes you have already heard the prologue and the teachings on chapters 1 through 4. We continue with the same covenant framework, historical context, and interpretive guardrails. Chapter 5 moves from argument to direct exhortation. Paul contrasts freedom in Messiah with justification through conversion obligation, warns about misplaced reliance on circumcision, and then gives one of his clearest teachings on spirit-led living and righteous conduct. This chapter is often misread as freedom from obedience. In context, it teaches freedom from distorted justification basis and freedom for spirit-empowered righteousness. Galatians chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, stand firm in freedom. Paul opens by commanding believers to stand firm in the freedom for which Messiah has set them free and not return to a yoke of bondage pattern obligation. He then gives a direct warning that if they accept circumcision as a justification requirement, Messiah will provide no benefit to them in that justification framework. Galatians 5, 1-2. Freedom here must be defined from context. Throughout Galatians, the freedom under discussion is freedom from justification through flesh identity requirements. It is not freedom from righteousness or obedience. Scripture elsewhere defines obedience positively. This is the love of Elohim, that we keep his commandments. 1 John 5:3. Because commandments are defined as an expression of love, freedom cannot mean removal of obedience. It means removal of distorted covenant entry demands. Yoke of bondage here refers to compelled conversion obligation as justification basis. Context connects this directly to the circumcision requirement being promoted by the opposing teachers. Galatians chapter 5, verses 3 through 4, obligation logic, and grace separation. Paul continues by stating that anyone who receives circumcision as a justification requirement becomes obligated to keep the entire law as a justification system. He then says that those who seek to be justified through law have been severed from Messiah and have fallen from grace. Galatians 5, 3-4. Obligated here refers to legal system obligation as justification mechanism. If law performance is chosen as the basis for covenant standing, then complete performance is required. Partial performance cannot justify under that system. That is Paul's legal logic. Fallen from grace does not describe moral stumbling. It describes leaving grace-based justification and moving to law-based justification. Grace here means unearned covenant standing granted through Messiah. This warning only makes sense if circumcision is being treated as a justification entry requirement, not as a neutral cultural practice. Context, again, controls meaning. Galatians chapter 5, verses 5-6, faith working through love. Paul explains that believers await righteousness, hope through the Spirit by faith. He then states that in Messiah, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has justification value, but faith working through love does. Galatians 5, 5-6. Faith working through love is active language, not passive belief language. Faith produces expressed covenant loyalty and love-shaped behavior. This directly rejects the idea that Paul teaches inactive belief without obedience. Scripture confirms the same pattern elsewhere. Faith without works is dead. James 2:26. There is no contradiction here when categories are preserved. Faith is the justification basis. Works are the living evidence of that faith. Galatians chapter 5, verses 7-9. Influence warning. Paul tells them they had been running well, but were hindered by someone who interfered with their obedience to truth. He says this persuasion does not come from the one who calls them, and adds that a small amount of corrupting influence spreads through the whole group. Galatians 5, 7-9. Obedience to truth again shows that truth is not merely believed, but obeyed. The distortion being introduced produces obedience disruption, not obedience growth. The spreading influence illustration shows that doctrinal error is not contained. It multiplies if not corrected. Paul treats justification distortion as a community danger issue, not a private preference issue. Galatians chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. Accountability and strong language. Paul expresses confidence that the believers will return to right understanding, and he says that the one troubling them will bear judgment. He then addresses a false accusation that he still preaches circumcision and explains that if he did so, the offense of the Messiah's execution message would disappear. He uses strong rhetorical language about those who are pressuring circumcision justification, Galatians 5:10-12. Offense of the Messiah's execution message refers to the scandal that justification comes through Messiah's atoning death rather than through covenant identity performance. That message removes human boasting and status advantage. That is why it produces offense. Paul's strong rhetoric here reflects the seriousness of the distortion threat. It is corrective force language, not casual insult. Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, freedom directed toward love and service. Paul now explains how freedom in Messiah is meant to function. He says believers are called to freedom, but that this freedom must not be used as an opportunity for flesh-pattern living. Instead, they are to serve one another through love. He then states that the whole law is fulfilled in the command to love one's neighbor as oneself. He warns that if they turn to hostile internal conflict, they will damage one another. Galatians 5:13-15. Freedom here is again freedom from distorted justification systems, not freedom from righteous conduct. Flesh pattern living refers to self-directed, status-driven, desire-ruled behavior rather than spirit-directed obedience. Serve one another through love shows that freedom produces responsibility, not independence from obligation. Love is expressed through action toward others. This aligns with Messiah's summary of the commandment structure. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19:18. When Paul says the whole law is fulfilled in this command, he is identifying love as the summary expression of covenant obedience, not the cancellation of commandments. Love functions as the governing principle that directs righteous behavior. Galatians chapter 5, verses 16 through 18, walking by the Spirit. Paul instructs believers to walk by the Spirit so they will not carry out flesh-pattern desires. He explains that flesh-pattern desire and spirit direction oppose each other, creating an internal conflict, and he says that those led by the Spirit are not under law in the sense he has been arguing throughout the letter. Galatians 5:16-18. Walk by the Spirit means to live under the guidance, power, and direction of the Spirit of Elohim. Walk is a Hebrew-style metaphor for daily life conduct pattern. Flesh here again refers to self-governing, status-centered, desire-driven identity pattern, not merely the physical body. Spirit refers to Yahovah's empowering and directing presence, producing righteous character and conduct. Not under law here must be interpreted consistently with Paul's earlier usage in this letter. It refers to not being under law as a justification-condemnation jurisdiction system. It cannot mean law definition disappears because Paul immediately defines sinful behaviors in the next verses using categories that come from Torah commandments. Through the law comes knowledge of sin. Romans 3:20. If sin is defined by law, then spirit-led living cannot mean living without that definition. It means living beyond condemnation jurisdiction and within spirit-empowered obedience. Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21, works of the flesh defined. Paul lists behaviors that flow from flesh pattern living. These include sexual immorality, impurity, uncontrolled desire, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, rivalry, jealousy, rage, factionalism, division, envy, drunkenness, and similar practices. He warns that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of Elohim. Galatians 5:19-21. This list is behavior definition language. It shows that Paul absolutely maintains moral standards. These behaviors are condemned as incompatible with kingdom inheritance. Many items in this list directly correspond to Torah prohibitions, including sexual immorality, idolatry, and occult practice. That confirms again that Paul is not discarding moral instruction categories. He is applying them. Will not inherit the kingdom is inheritance language consistent with the promise heir theme throughout Galatians. Behavior matters as inheritance evidence, even though it is not the justification basis. Basis and evidence remain distinct categories. Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, fruit of the Spirit. Paul then lists the fruit produced by Spirit-led living. This includes love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. He adds that there is no law against such things. Galatians 5:22-23. Fruit means produced character outcome, not self-generated merit. Spirit fruit grows from Spirit-directed life. It is evidence of transformation, not a purchase price of justification. No law against such things means these qualities are fully aligned with Yahovah's righteous instruction. Law never condemns love, faithfulness, or self-control. Law supports and affirms them. This again shows harmony between Spirit-led living and righteousness definition. Spirit and law are not enemies in Paul's theology. Galatians chapter 5, verses 24-26, crucified flesh and spirit living. Paul concludes the chapter by saying that those who belong to Messiah have crucified the flesh pattern with its passions and desires. He says that if believers live by the Spirit, they should also walk in step with the Spirit. He warns against prideful comparison and envy toward one another. Galatians 5:24-26. Crucified flesh pattern means decisive rejection of self-ruled identity and desire-governed living. It is covenant transfer language, not physical harm language. Walk in step with the Spirit repeats the earlier command using alignment imagery. Spirit life is not passive. It is directed conduct. The closing warning about pride and envy shows that community conduct remains central. Spirit-led freedom produces humility and mutual respect, not status competition. End of Galatians chapter 5.